The day my father called me a disappointment in front of 230 guests, I was wearing my nursing medal from the Regional Health Authority of BC on a lanyard around my neck. I'd earned it 6 months earlier for coordinating the trauma response during the Lytton wildfire evacuations. 43 patients transferred in 72 hours, 3 of them critical, none of them lost. But standing in the banquet hall of the Fairmont Hotel Vancouver, with my father's voice echoing off the marble floors, none of that felt real. What felt real was the heat in my face, and the way everyone in the room had gone absolutely still. Let me back up. My name is Evelyn, and my father built Hartwell Construction into one of the largest commercial development firms in Western Canada. He started with nothing. That's the story he tells at every dinner party, every charity gala, every quarterly board meeting. Started with nothing, a truck, and a work ethic that could crack pavement. By the time I was 7, we had a house in West Vancouver with a view of the inlet and a housekeeper who came 4 days a week. By the time I was 12, he was on the cover of BC Business magazine. By the time I was 20, I had already learned that nothing I did would ever be quite right. I wanted to be a nurse. That was the first mistake. "You have the grades for medicine," he said, sitting at the head of our dining room table, the kind of table that seated 12, even when there were only 3 of us. Why would you settle? I tried to explain that I wasn't settling, that nursing was where I felt the work actually happened, the hands-on, hour to hour, sitting with someone at 3 in the morning when they're scared, and the doctor has already moved on. He listened the way he always listened to things he'd already decided not to hear. Nodded once. Poured himself more wine. "Your mother was a nurse," he said finally, as if that explained something. "She'd passed when I was 4. I barely remembered her. He'd never remarried. I got my nursing degree from UBC. My father came to the convocation ceremony because his assistant reminded him. He shook my hand at a reception, told me he was proud, and then spent 45 minutes talking to the dean of the Faculty of Medicine about a building endowment. I didn't chase his approval after that. I just did my job. For 9 years, I worked at Vancouver General, then moved to the BC Interior for 2 years during the Health Authority restructuring. That's where I met James. James worked with BC Emergency Health Services, coordinating ground and air ambulance logistics across the interior. He was from Prince George originally, broad-shouldered and quiet in that way that isn't emptiness. It's the quiet of someone who thinks before they speak, who means what they say. On our 3rd date, sitting outside a Tim Hortons in Kamloops at 11 at night, because neither of us had anywhere better to be and neither of us wanted to leave, he told me about losing a crew member during a mountain rescue 3 years earlier. No details, no drama, just that it happened, and that it had changed what he thought about time. I knew then. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. Simple, no performance, hiking trail outside Kelowna. Just the 2 of us, late September when the Lakeview Hills had gone gold. He'd had the ring in his jacket pocket for the whole hike and he'd almost lost it crossing a creek. He showed me the damp patch on his pocket as proof and I laughed so hard I cried. My father met James twice before the engagement. Both times were brief. Both times my father was polite in that particular way. That means he's already formed his opinion and is simply waiting for an appropriate moment to say it. James noticed. He didn't mention it because James is the kind of person who waits to see if something is actually a problem before treating it like one. The problem made itself clear at Christmas dinner that year. My father had flown my Aunt Beverly in from Calgary and a couple of his old business partners. We'd barely sat down before he started. "So," he said, looking at James the way he looks at contractors who've gone over budget. "Emergency services. That's government work, is it?" James said yes. Explained the structure of BCEHS, kept his voice even. "So a union position then? Salary cap." "Dad, I'm asking. I'm allowed to ask." James said the pay was fair for the work. My father nodded in the way that meant he was recording the answer as evidence. Later that night, after James had gone to bed, my father found me in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me rinse dishes. "You know I just want what's best for you," he said. I turned off the tap. "I know you believe that." He went to bed without responding. I stood there in the kitchen for a long time with the water dripping and the lights of the harbour going on and on outside the window. We set the wedding for June. The venue was the Fairmont. My father insisted on paying, and I made the mistake of accepting because I thought it might soften things. 4 months of planning, most of it handled by the hotel's event coordinator, because my father's contribution was a credit card number and a list of his own guests that numbered 97 people. I knew maybe 60 of the 230 attending. It was his event wearing my name. James's side was small, his mother and father, both from Prince George. Quiet, warm people who'd driven down and were clearly a little overwhelmed by the scale of the thing. His two closest friends from EHS, a couple of colleagues. His supervisor, a woman named Dr. Power, Patricia Grantham. And here I have to pause because Dr. Grantham matters to what happened later. Dr. Patricia Grantham had been Chief Medical Officer of BC Emergency Health Services for 11 years. Before that, she'd been the Medical Director of the Provincial Disaster Response Programme. She had been on the ground for the 2013 Lac-Mégantic response, the Fort McMurray fires, the 2021 BC floods. She was 61 years old, and she had the kind of presence you notice before you know why. James had worked under her for 6 years. She'd come to the wedding because she said she wouldn't miss it. She sat in the third row on James's side. My father didn't know who she was. The ceremony was beautiful. I mean that without irony. The room was full of flowers, and the light coming through the tall windows had that particular softness of a Vancouver June afternoon. James cried when I walked down the aisle, which made me cry, which made his mother cry, and somewhere behind me I heard one of his EHS colleagues mutter something and laugh quietly. It was at the reception. We'd finished the first round of speeches. The best man, my maid of honour, the usual, and my father stood up to speak. I should have known. I should have seen it in the way he'd been drinking since cocktail hour, in the way he'd barely spoken to James all evening, in the way he'd looked at my nursing medal, the one from the Listen response, the one I'd chosen to wear because it had mattered, because those 43 people had mattered, with an expression I recognised but couldn't name until he opened his mouth. "My daughter," he said, into the microphone, into the silence of 230 people who'd stopped eating and were looking at him, "has always done things her own way, always been stubborn." A few laughs from his side of the room. She chose a career I didn't understand, a path I wouldn't have chosen for her. She turned down every opportunity I tried to give her. And now she's married a government employee. A pause. Some uncomfortable shifting. He was smiling, but the smile didn't reach anything. "I suppose we don't always get to choose our children's choices." He looked directly at me. "I do have to say, Evelyn, I love you, but that thing on your lanyard looks like something out of a Cracker Jack box. Maybe tonight you could take it off and look like a bride for once." The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something has just happened that no one is sure how to respond to. I felt my face go still. I felt my hands on the table in front of me. James put his hand over mine. I looked at my father and said, clearly, "No." One word. He blinked. "No, I won't take it off, and I'd appreciate it if you sat down." There's a version of this story where he does, where he reads the room, feels the embarrassment, takes his seat. But my father has spent 40 years being the person whose authority is not questioned, and so he didn't sit down. He laughed, a short dismissive sound, and said, "Always the dramatics." He reached toward me. I don't know exactly what he intended. I think he meant to gesture toward the medal, maybe pull at the lanyard. He was drunk and annoyed and accustomed to getting what he wanted. James stood up before my father's hand touched anything. James is not a loud person. He did not raise his voice. He just stood up, put himself between me and my father, and said, "Sir, sit down now." The calmness of it was somehow more affecting than any shout. My father stared at him. That's when Dr. Grantham stood up. She didn't stand quickly. She rose the way someone stands up when they've decided something, and there's no rush because the outcome isn't in question. She was in a grey blazer, a little underdressed for the Fairmont, and she didn't reach for a microphone, just spoke in a voice that carries, the voice of someone who has given instructions in chaos and been heard. "Excuse me," she said. The whole room turned. "I've spent 30 years in emergency medicine," she said. "I've worked alongside nurses who worked back-to-back 48-hour shifts in wildfire evacuation zones. I've stood in field hospitals and watched nurses make triage decisions that saved lives when there was no physician present. I have signed commendations and filed reports and testified before provincial health committees about the professional standard of this province's nursing workforce." She paused, not for effect, just because she was choosing her words. "The medal your daughter is wearing was issued by the BC Regional Health Authority for her work during the Lytton emergency response. I know because I was there. I reviewed the incident report. I know what she did." She looked at my father the way she probably looked at budget proposals she was about to reject. "You should be very proud." Then she sat down. I don't know if I've ever heard 230 people be that quiet simultaneously. My father stood for a moment longer. Then he sat down. He didn't speak again for the rest of the evening. I don't think I really breathed for about 30 seconds. I felt James's hand on the back of my chair, and I turned to look at him, and he gave me the smallest nod, just checking that I was okay, and I nodded back. My maid of honor, bless her, started clapping. Not mockingly, genuinely. And then the room started clapping, slowly at first, then fully, the way a room does when it's releasing something it's been holding. Someone from James's EHS team stood and raised his glass. "To Evelyn," he said, "who's been taking care of people since before most of us knew we needed it." I cried. I'm not ashamed of it. I sat at my own wedding table, and I cried, and James passed me a handkerchief, an actual handkerchief, because he's the kind of person who carries one. And the evening went on. My father left before the cake. I heard from my Aunt Beverly the next morning. She called from her hotel room before her flight back to Calgary, and she said, "I need you to know that what your father said was wrong." She paused. "I've known for a long time that he has trouble seeing past what he wanted for you. But last night was—" She paused again. "I'm sorry it happened at your wedding. I told her I appreciated her calling. I meant it. What happened with my father afterward didn't happen in a single conversation. It rarely does with families like ours. But I'll tell you what I know. 3 weeks after the wedding, 2 senior partners at Hartwell Construction requested a meeting with the board. There had been concerns, ongoing concerns apparently, that predated the wedding entirely, about my father's judgment on several major contracts, a pattern of decision-making that the board had been watching for 2 years. The wedding incident was, I was told later by Beverly, the thing that finally made people feel comfortable saying what they'd been thinking. My father didn't lose the company, but he stepped back from day-to-day operations in October. The press release called it a planned transition to a board advisory role. Beverly called me and read it to me over the phone, and I sat with it for a while. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something more like grief. Grief for the relationship we'd never quite managed to have, for the version of him I'd spent 20 years hoping would show up. He called me in November. It was a short call. He said he'd been thinking about what happened, that he'd said things he shouldn't have. He didn't say the word sorry. My father is constitutionally incapable of that particular word. But he said he'd been thinking, and that was more than I'd ever heard before. I told him I'd received a commendation from the health authority for the 3rd time in 4 years. There was a pause, and then he said, "You always were the most competent person in any room you were in. You got that from your mother." I hadn't known he thought that. I still don't know what we are to each other now. It's a work in progress, like most things that have been broken and aren't quite put back together yet. James says you don't need to resolve everything to move forward, and I'm learning to trust that he's right. The medal still sits on my dresser. Not the lanyard, I don't wear it every day, but the medal. Sometimes in the morning I see it in the mirror, and I think about those 72 hours in Lytton, the night we transferred the last critical patient just as the highway closed behind us. The particular quality of relief in the truck on the way back when my colleague and I didn't say anything for a long time because there was nothing adequate to say. Honor is not something anyone hands you. It's not in the framing of a certificate, or the thread count of a hotel banquet room, or the square footage of a house in West Vancouver. It's in the decision you make at 3 in the morning when you're exhausted and afraid, and the thing that's needed is hard, and you do it anyway. My father built a company with his hands and his will, and I respect that. But the thing he could never quite see, the thing Dr. Grantham said in 12 seconds in a hotel ballroom that my father had never managed in 30 years, is that I had been doing the same thing, just in rooms he'd never thought to look. James understood that from the beginning. That might be why I married him. I keep thinking about the way Dr. Grantham stood up. Not quickly, not with any urgency, just decided. Like she'd already done the calculation and the only thing left was the standing. I've worked in rooms where people saw something wrong and looked at their plates. I've done it myself, if I'm honest. There's a kind of cowardice that wears the costume of politeness, and most of us learn it so young we don't recognize it anymore. What Dr. Grantham did wasn't heroic in the dramatic sense. She just refused to wear that costume. She said what was true in a room where saying nothing would have been much easier, and then she sat back down. That's what I keep coming back to. My father is not a stupid man. He built something real, from nothing, with his own hands and will. But somewhere in the building of it, he confused the map for the territory. He started believing that the things money could measure were the only things worth measuring. And so he looked at my medal and saw a trinket, because he had no framework for valuing what it represented. The 72 hours, the highway closing behind us, the weight of being responsible for people who had nowhere else to turn. When you can only see value through one lens, you will keep misreading everything that doesn't fit it. That's not cruelty exactly. It's a kind of poverty that looks like abundance from the outside. What I've learned, slowly, imperfectly, still learning, is that integrity isn't something you announce. It's just the accumulation of the decisions you make when no one important is watching. All those 3 a.m. shifts, all those moments of staying with a patient longer than required because they were afraid and needed someone to stay. Nobody gave me a medal for most of it. The one I did receive sat on my lanyard and got called a cracker-jack toy in front of 230 people, and I looked at my father and said no. One word. That one word had been building for 20 years. James understood something about this intuitively, that I had to learn consciously, that the quality of your character is determined not by the scale of the room you're standing in, but by whether you can be the same person in every room. He is. In 30 years of marriage, I expect he will still be. The man who stood up between me and my father at the Fairmont is the same man who drives 4 hours without complaint when a crew needs support, who carries a handkerchief, who thinks before he speaks. Resilience isn't about not being hurt. I was hurt. I sat at my own wedding table and cried. But you go forward anyway, not because the hurt wasn't real, but because the thing you're moving toward is more real. The work, the people, the life you chose because it meant something, not because it impressed anyone. My father called in November. He couldn't say sorry, but he said he'd been thinking. And he said I got something from my mother. That was enough for now. Maybe someday it'll be more. The medal is still on my dresser. I see it every morning. That's enough.